There's something I need to say before I begin my paper. In 1966, Adorno declared, quote, "A new categorical imperative has been imposed by Hitler upon unfree mankind to arrange their thoughts and actions so that Auschwitz will not repeat itself, so that nothing similar will happen," end quote. In the years since it was published, Adorno's declaration has been reduced to an edifying homily. This is the revenge of the culture industry. But as I speak, in 283 kilometers from my home in Beirut, the population of Gaza is being systematically exterminated by the Israel Defense Forces. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, roughly 31,000 Palestinians have been killed so far. But Euromed Human Rights Watch estimates that the real figure is probably well over 40,000. 40% of the victims are children. This means that at least 16,000 children have been killed. As Israel prepares another ground offensive to force the 1.5 million Palestinians sheltering in southern Gaza out into Egypt's Sinai Desert, and with the US repeatedly vetoing calls for ceasefire, it is clear there is no end in sight. This is not war, it is genocide, deliberate, methodical, orchestrated mass murder. Yet eminent academics throughout Europe and North America, including some who call themselves critical theorists and who cite Adorno as an inspiration, not only refuse to describe it as such, but are busy contriving excuses or justifications for Israel's crimes. Adorno's legacy is tainted by this complicity. Throughout his work, he insists that truth pierces the veil of semblance and calls things by their proper name. I do not know how he would have responded to what is happening in Gaza, but I feel it is a categorical imperative to call it by its proper name, genocide, if the emancipatory promise of Adorno's thought is to be salvaged. Okay, now I'll begin. In Negative Dialectics, Adorno writes, quote, "Dialectics is the ontology of the wrong state of things. The right state of things would be free of it, neither a system nor a contradiction," end quote. If dialectics is the ontology of what is insofar as it is wrong, what is it that is wrong and why? We might answer schematically. The semblance of rightness, the identification of what is with what should be. But wouldn't this insistence that rightness or justice remains forever out of human reach be a paradigmatic expression of beautiful soulism, and thereby fundamentally anti-dialectical? To see why this is not so, we must clarify Adorno's account of the difference between positive and negative dialectics. Adorno charges Hegel's idealism with ultimately reaffirming the positivity of the immediacy which it initially negates. He emphatically rejects the claim, characteristic of what he calls positive dialectics, that the redoubling of negated immediacy, i.e. the negation of negation, redeems immediacy or being. Indeed, as we shall see, he views this as the essential difference between a positive or idealist dialectics and a negative or materialist dialectics. The speculative redemption of actuality, which grasps the rose and the cross of the present, in Hegel's famous formulation, is the relapse into ontology, and hence a regression from critique. Negative dialectics, by way of contrast, seeks to de-ontologize mediated immediacy. And it does so by fastening upon contradictions that cannot be resolved or raised up, aufgehoben, which is to say, rationally redeemed or justified. Yet it also insists that this irresolvability is historical and not eternal. The irredeemability of what is contingent. Things could be otherwise. The possibility of alterity is precisely what distinguishes critical from metaphysical pessimism or Schopenhauerism. Dialectics salvages the possibility of redemption by denying its actuality. But this denial is itself temporary, which is to say historical. If it were not, the refusal of affirmation would flip over into an affirmation of refusal. And negative dialectics balances precariously between not affirming and affirming what is not. Neither the eternity nor transitoriness of contradiction is guaranteed. Thus, dialectics is historically conditioned, not because it is limited to a particular temporal perspective, which cannot grasp history as totality or absolute. This is not historicism. But because it exposes the speculative totalization of history as an illusory absoluteness, one that presents history as ineluctable nature or being once again. It is because dialectics unfolds the falseness of the whole that it can be called the ontology of the wrong state of things. Ontology is a bad word for Adorno. It means Heidegger. Ontology, because being is false immediacy, and wrong, because this false immediacy presents itself as truly mediated, as rightly justified by spirit as a whole. But it is precisely the wholeness of spirit that can only appear in mutilated form. The wrong state of things is coercion presented as consensuality, unfreedom masquerading as freedom. Ultimately, it is capitalism as fatality. However, if, as Frederick Jameson suggests, the absolute opposition between rightness and wrongness is the ultimate anti-dialectical binary that haunts every subsidiary metaphysical opposition, how could it prove the hinge for articulating the historicity of dialectics? How could the historical dialectic revolve around Adorno's seemingly theological contrast between fallen actuality and redemptive utopia? How could splinters of truth persist within the false whole? To see how, we must briefly recapitulate the trajectory from critical philosophy to positive dialectics and from positive to negative dialectics. And Kant's critical philosophy demonstrates that every affirmation or judgment of what is implies an ought insofar as it imposes logical or conceptual form onto sensory content. To assert that this creature is a chordate entails that it is also a renate. Anyone endorsing the former is obliged to endorse the latter. Hegel complicates the schema by transposing Kant's epistemological articulation of ought and is into the phenomenological relation of essence to appearance, what the thing ought to be and what it is. The former stands to the latter as the object stands to its proper concept. Appearance falls short of essence. The is contradicts its own ought. Yet the ought cannot be separated from the is without being hypostatized and turned into another is. Hylozoism, matter-generating form, is the obverse of hylomorphism, form subjugating matter. Each affirmatively synthesizes thinking and being, or ought and is, without critically articulating their interdependence as contradictory. For what is not simply beholden to what ought to be. This ought is in turn vitiated by the is which it fails to live up to, by the is which fails to live up to it, sorry. If conciliating is and ought, or the finite and the infinite, is the lodestar of Hegel's dialectic, doing so prematurely falsifies both. So Adorno charges Hegel with prematurely mending Kant's critical fault line, thereby reinstating a dogmatic synthesis. between the conceptual normative and the causal, asserting the rationality of the actual and the actuality of the rational signals an Aristotelian regression in his eyes. Yet dialectics cannot simply oppose affirmation to negation. It must register their disavowed interpenetration, together with the irresolvable tension between universal and particular, form and content. The right whole implied in every finite judgment is not. The good or true infinite can be neither disavowed nor affirmed. Dialectics is this tension, which is multifaceted. Preliminarily, we can distinguish three registers of non-identity in Adorno's work. First, the logical, speculative non-identity of the concept with itself. Second, the empirical, experiential non-identity of the thing with its concept. And third, the non-identity of part and whole. All three revolve around the capitalist law of exchange. This is the synthetic principle factitiously uniting thought, experience, and society, while sundering them, and in so doing, maintaining the diremption between the possibility and the actuality of human freedom. Thus, it is through the law of exchange that the semblance of social unity is perpetuated, while intensifying exploitation and domination effectively disintegrated. So, as Adorno puts it, this is a quote from his Introduction to Dialectics. The world is construed as a unity, produced as a socialized totality, which is internally unified down to its particular features, through the very principle by which it is also divided. And it is precisely here that the materialist version of the dialectic is extraordinarily close to the idealist version, insofar as the former attempted to grasp and develop that unified but internally contradictory principle in objective terms, precisely as the principle of exchange, which indeed harbors both the antagonistic and the internally unified character of a world governed by the process of exchange. End quote. So, if Marx's dialectic deserves to be called materialist, this is insofar as it transplants the essential contradiction from the spiritual, historic, to the social realm. It is not the true whole, but the false one that articulates form and content. It is not the notion that unifies identity and non-identity, but the principle of exchange. Here's another quote from Adorno. This is from Marx on the basic concept of sociological theory. I think a lecture from 1963 or 64. If one exchanges the same for the same, and the word he uses is gleiche. In other words, one exchanges abstract labor for abstract labor, the equivalence of value, and simultaneously the same for the not same, or abstract labor for concrete labor. When you sell labor power to the capitalist, labor power is exchanged abstractly but consumed concretely, and this is the source of surplus value. This is the Adorno again. Behind this exchange lies the entirety of class relations. Only because the worker has nothing else but his labor power does he accept these conditions. End quote. So the dialectics of identity and non-identity is rooted in this non-equivalence, both within exchange as such and between the logic of exchange and the reality of the class relation, the division of producers from the means of production, which enforces the law of exchange. The first points to the non-equivalence of concrete and abstract labor time as source of surplus value. The second to the class antagonism upon which the logic of exchange depends. But unlike his friend Alfred Sohn-Rethel, Adorno does not oppose the concretion of use to the abstraction of exchange as first to second nature. To positivize use, or more specifically social function, as something naturally given is also to mythologize it. Adorno sees that the discrepancy between use and exchange is itself enveloped by the exchange abstraction. And to juxtapose the concretion of use to the abstraction of exchange as first to second nature is to mistake socially mediated semblance for being. The critical thrust of Adorno's analysis lies in noticing that the equivalence instituted by the exchange abstraction depends upon the inequality of capitalist and labor, and not just the non-equivalence of concrete and abstract labor. The latter is internal to exchange. Non-equivalence of concrete and abstract labor is internal to exchange, whereas the former is external. But if the exchange equivalence is conditioned by class inequality, then the latter is also conditioned by the former. Dialectics becomes materialist insofar as it recognizes that the unresolved tension between universal and particular, form and content, ought and is objectively realized in the social totality incarnated by the principle of exchange. And recognizing this materialization of speculative logic compels thought to acknowledge that the logical direction of thought and thing, incarnated in the social system to which everything is compelled to submit, must be, and not is, I say must because it's not given, this distinction, it must be seconded by a real direction between theory and system, or between the concept and the identity of concept and object. The former's experience of the concept and the latter as logicized experience. In other words, the distinction between the true and the false whole is compelled. You have to think this distinction because it's not given, okay? Because the idea is precisely, in a way, the social totality presents itself as complete, as not lacking anything or not hiding anything, and it's recognizing in a way the lack of lack, or the absence of anything missing, that is the critical gesture. In other words, there's something about thought must be interpolated. This distinction must be drawn from thought. It is not simply prescribed by actuality. So this tension between thought and thing is constitutive of dialectical thinking. It is this tension such that thinking cannot be self-identical. And dialectics salvages the irresolvable tension that animates it by denying its own premature realization. It persists in this unresolved tension it persists in the unresolved tension between concept and object, whose potential resolution in the absolutization of equivalence apes actual reconciliation. Acknowledging the actuality of the false and the reality of semblance compels dialectical thinking to affirm the dimension of identity and non-identity. And it is precisely the impossibility of their resolution in actuality that maintains the possibility of dialectics. Here's another quote from Adorno's introduction to dialectics. Quote, "The systematic character of the dialectic would be precisely that of the system which constitutes reality, namely the dynamic of a system which in a sense develops as a kind of fatality, a system whose fatal character every individual can realize and exhibit at every moment in each particular case." So the compulsion exercised by the world itself is the mute compulsion of economic relations. And Adorno points out that when Marx speaks of, quote, the natural laws governing capitalist society, he's not endorsing their alleged necessity, but exposing it as factitious. What presents itself as necessary is the result of self-estranged productive activity, assuming the form of what Marx calls an alien social power. The necessity that curbs freedom is in fact its estranged result. So that if history is the possibility of freedom, nature is the actuality of unfreedom. But this actuality is a result, not an origin. It is made, not given. So that what presents itself as natural in capitalist society is actual, but its actuality is an artifact of social activity. Thus, nature recurs in history, just as history emerges in nature. They cannot be juxtaposed as specific object domains, twin attributes of one substance, form and content, or law and force. Rather, their complex unity is neither materially univocal nor formally equivocal. For Adorno, quote, this is a quote from The Idea of Natural History. Nature is present in history as transience, and history is present in nature as something that has evolved and is transient, end quote. So if nature recurs within history as mediating transience, then history arises within nature as transient immediacy. And this mediation is internal, not external. The social totality is second nature as what occludes the history of its development by human hands. And this is what Hegel omits, but Marx fastens upon. While second nature or society as mediated immediacy hides its mediatedness, which is to say its history, this does not render its immediacy primary in the sense in which first nature can be said to be immediate. For Hegel, the exposure of mediation reveals the posited or mind-made character of immediacy. Its negativity or mediation is absorbed without remainder into its actuality. Second nature is first nature or nature once again. But for Marx, exposing mediation reveals the negativity or non-actuality of what presents itself as wholly actual. Social artifact presents itself as natural law. Critique not only exposes the mediating negativity dissimulated in ersatz actuality, it reveals its practical origin. What presents itself as integral actuality is constituted by excluding the absent actuality of its origin. The positivity of the objective order is instituted by denying what it excludes, practical subjective activity. But this activity is subordinated to the imperatives of social production, which requires the production of use values. Now, the production of use values is at once a subjective and objective process. It transforms first into second nature internally as well as externally. Practical activity creates humanity's inner psychic nature as a correlate of the outer physical nature it inhabits. But nature is not whatever is left over once we have subtracted culture. It is the residue of uselessness and ultimately of unexchangeability clinging to the production of usefulness. The residue which a society geared towards production for the sake of production seeks to extirpate. And it's human beings that become superfluous or useless as capitalism advances. It's not just things. The production of surplus populations means the production of exterminable humans. Denaturalization then does not just expose historical contrivance beneath what appears as biologically adaptive, it reveals the residual uselessness which social adaptation must perpetually repress. Thus, it is precisely denaturalization that gives nature its due. The nature against which bourgeois civil society sets itself as second nature, instituted in the forms of person and property, is not a positively characterizable first nature. It is negatively constituted by all those useless psychic impulses and sensory qualities that must be excised to secure the identity of the self and the exchangeability of the object. At either pole of the dynamic, social form mediates content, both subjective and objective. And ultimately, the identity yoking subject and object is not that of being or essence, whittled by metaphysical pathology into the contours of presence. It is that of self-valorizing value. The compulsion driving the subject to unify its impulsive states in the form of the self also necessitates binding the sensory manifold into the form of the object, or the object as commodity. It is a tributary of value, and the return of the repressed is not the return of an originary first nature, but of socially inculcated compulsion now deemed useless by existing social arrangements. What returns is what is worthless, and what is worthless is not biological instinct, sanctioned and encouraged by capitalist competition, but obsolete duty, whose value is unexchangeable. Uselessness is socially, not biologically adjudicated. Impulsive uselessness is the residue of negativity that renders freedom dialectically intelligible. It is the non-identity of an action carried out for the sake of something neither personally advantageous nor socially beneficial in a context where these constitute the identity of an action as exercised by a combative ego. Thus, Adorno writes, this is from Negative Dialectics, quote, "Men are human only where they do not act, let alone posit themselves as persons. The diffuseness of nature in which they are not persons resembles the lineaments of an intelligible being, of a self that would be delivered from the ego," end quote. So freedom then acquires intelligible being not in the shape of character or personality, but precisely through those acts that are involuntary or unfree in Kant's sense, acts that are neither self-interested in the utilitarian sense, nor disinterested in the moral sense, i.e., divestments of personal interest that reiterate the self-subordination to collective interest. The self's deliverance from the ego is the subject's deliverance from the socially mandated imperative of self-preservation. It is at this juncture that the concept of causality reemerges as the crux of Adorno's meta-critique of Kant. The binding power of synthesis through which the subject is able to legislate causality to nature while exempting itself from causal determination by nature derives its potency from an affinity between conditioning and condition, whose source is neither empirical nor transcendental. Kant describes affinity, quote, as the objective ground of the association of all appearances, end quote. Yet it is precisely as objectively necessary and not empirically contingent that Kant roots this ground in pure apperception and thereby in the understanding. For Kant, affinity is a function of apperception, which for Adorno means identity. Thus, Adorno must construct his own concept of affinity in the interstices of Kant's. It is summoned to account for the commonality of condition and conditioned, operating beneath the machinery of representation that binds intuitions to concepts. Affinity is likeness subsisting beneath identity. In this sense, it is the residue of the object in the subject, the remainder that enables its objectivating syntheses. As Adorno puts it, quote, in order to have the capacity with which Kant credits it, that of constituting objectivity or objectivating itself in the act, the subject, for its part, must always be something that is also objective, end quote. So affinity enables the free act which Kant vainly ascribes to a will split between the phenomenal and noumenal realms. It is this split which Kant tries desperately to bridge by postulating the existence of the pure will, uncontaminated by empirical motives. However, by turning the will's rational determination into an a priori fact, Kant ontologizes the noumenal. In the alleged inevitability of the will's pure rational determination, Adorno writes, quote, something empirical, and I think by this he means compulsion, social compulsion, acquires a supra-empirical authority by stealth, by the strength of the affection it exerts, end quote. The rational compulsion, which Kant views as an a priori fact, is for Adorno socially inculcated, where Kant strives to preserve the purity of this compulsion from pathological inclination. Adorno sees in the latter the mainspring for an activity that might be free precisely insofar as it evades the socially mandated necessity, whose rationality simply reiterates the imperatives of self-preservation. So it's because rational necessity is the unwitting mime of natural compulsion, and because the necessity of inference envelops the compulsion to adapt, that unnecessary inclinations and non-adaptive impulses are the elements capable of undoing the social compulsion that masquerades as rational freedom. Impulse or drive, I mean, the extent, I think Adorno used the word impulse, but it's also drive, I think, in the psychoanalytic sense that's meant. Impulse or drive becomes a symptom of the affinity whereby the subject is capable of affecting the object otherwise than as objectively programmed, precisely through that part of subjectivity which is also an object. Quote, this is Adorno again. Quote, consciousness is a ramification of the energy of drives. It is part impulse itself and also a moment of that in which it intervenes. If there were not that affinity, which Kant so furiously denies, neither would there be the idea of freedom, for whose sake he denies the affinity, end quote. So, affinity is not the ontological guarantor of freedom, and yet it is indispensable for its idea. Where Kant moves illegitimately from the concept of pure will to its existence, forcibly subordinating empirical volition to noumenal agency, Adorno seeks a dialectical proxy for the will capable of undoing the opposition between activity and passivity, which is here akin to the divide between reasons and causes. And this proxy is the concept of, forgive my pronunciation, das Hinzusetzende, or the additional factor. That's the English rendering, which I realize is not ideal. And here's a quote, again, from Negative Dialectics. The additional factor is an impulse, the rudiments of a phase in which the dualism of extramental and intramental was not thoroughly consolidated yet, neither volitively bridgeable nor an ontological ultimate. The impulse, intramental and somatic in one, drives beyond the conscious sphere to which it belongs just the same. And with that impulse, freedom extends to the realm of experience. This animates the concept of freedom as a state that would no more be blind nature than it would be oppressed nature. End quote. The concept of the additional factor is that of non-apperceptive and therefore non-conceptual spontaneity. And at the same time, it is a determinate inclination, but one that is neither programmed by instinct nor conditioned by stimulus. It indexes a freedom that has not only been forgotten, but it has become unenvisageable. It points towards Adorno's conception of utopian possibility. This is not the possibility of utopia, but utopia as possibility released from the grip of substantial actuality. Utopian possibility cannot be projected from actuality because whatever is what should not be, the wrong state of things. The possibility of freedom is not encoded in social actuality, which is the actuality of semblance. And yet its insubstantiality does not project it into the inert ether of the ideal. Utopian possibility is real because it is the possibility of puncturing substantial actuality or being generated by this actuality itself. Nature is the ineluctability of what is, physi, in Adorno's rendering, physi, or the natural. Yet what is ineluctable is also what we have made. It's thesi, or positive. Second nature or duty cannot completely subjugate first nature or inclination because the impulse to subjugate relays the impulse it seeks to extirpate. So the ineluctability of nature is mandated by the socially enforced amnesia that what is also what we have made. It is sociality as alien power, the negative totality of social semblance that forces us to forget the freedom we once had and prevents us from recognizing the freedom we could have. Yet freedom erupts nevertheless. It flashes forth, as Adorno puts it, in a momentary reunification of inner and outer nature that is out of sync with their synchronized segregation, a synchronized segregation which is organized by the principle of exchange. Freedom erupts in the maladaptiveness of the useless impulse recurring within useful obligation. So in this regard, the additional factor is Adorno's attempt to salvage the reality of freedom, not in spite of, but through the very contradictoriness of its concept. Quote again. So this is from Negative Dialectics again. Subjects are free after the Kantian model, insofar as they are aware of and identical with themselves. And then again, they are unfree in such identity, insofar as they are subjected to and will perpetuate its compulsion. They are unfree as diffuse non-identical nature, and yet, as that nature, they are free because the impulses which overpower them, the subject's non-identity with itself is nothing else, also rid them of the coercive character of identity. Personality, which Adorno means the noumenal character governing the empirical person, is the caricature of freedom. The ground of the aporia is that truth beyond compulsory identity would not be simply and wholly other to that compulsion, rather it would be mediated by it. So, the contradiction inherent in the Kantian concept of freedom points to its overcoming. The actuality of a non-contradictory freedom in which the compulsiveness of identification would express rather than repress the diffuse non-identity in the subject. The reconciliation of subject and object is not their fusion, but their interpenetration, such that each prevents the other from coagulating into a homogeneous substance. And yet their non-identity would persist through this interpenetration. Thus, freedom is not the dissolution of identity, but its decoupling from the imperative of self-preservation. So, is utopian freedom real or ideal, actual or possible? Contradiction in the ideal is not to be juxtaposed to non-contradiction in the real, as though the latter were simply the negation of the former. Contradiction is precisely what links the ideal to the real, the subject to the object. The actuality of contradiction splits actuality between semblance and truth. And contradiction indicates this split or non-identity, fissuring both concept and object. Thus, the actuality of freedom is split between semblance, the spontaneity of personality, and truth, the spontaneity of impulse. But the latter is not opposed to the former. It is the truth of its untruth, or the reality of its semblance. And similarly, if second nature stands to first nature as repressing to repressed, the return of the repressed is the compulsive residue clinging to repression itself. It is dominated first nature recurring in and as dominating second nature. Thus, non-identity is not the contrary or opposite of identification, but its ineliminable remainder. And perhaps the crux of negative dialectics lies in the insistence that actuality cannot wholly comprehend or recapitulate its own genesis. Not only is there a shortfall between actuality and rationality, such that what is actual encompasses irrational residues, the rationalization of the actual secretes an irrational surplus, which cannot be cancelled through further rationalization. Yet if identification cannot abolish compulsion, neither can compulsion abolish identification. The antagonism between reason and unreason, or identity and non-identity, persists in an uneasy détente. But if freedom is a real possibility, so is their reconciliation. So the reality of freedom persists not just despite, but in and through its actual impossibility, because freedom's truth is not simply the abstract negation of its current untruth, its subordination to compulsory identity. True freedom, in Adorno's account, is the determinate negation of compulsory identity. It is activity unencumbered by self-preservation, compulsion beyond adaptation. And this resurgence of determinate negation in Adorno's thought is reinforced by a particularly charged passage of negative dialectics entitled Causality as Spell. Adorno writes, affinity is the apex of a dialectic of enlightenment. It regresses into delusion, i.e. this dialectic regresses into delusion, into a conceptless execution from outside, once it breaks completely with affinity. Without affinity, there is no truth. This is what idealism caricatured in the philosophy of identity. But affinity is not a remnant which cognition hands us after the identifying schemata of the categorical machinery have been eliminated. Rather, affinity is the determinate negation of those schemata. There is an elective affinity between the subjectivity of causality and the objects, a distant sense of what has happened to them at the subject's hands. So affinity is not a positively characterizable property of things in themselves. It is revealed when thinking reflects upon what compels it to compel appearances to conform to law. What compels appearances to conform to law is causality as a power of the subject. But causality as subjective condition of objective experience mimes the causal power which unreflective consciousness attributes to things in themselves. It simply relocates it in the mind and limits its scope to appearances. In doing so, the mind appropriates the determining power it previously attributed to objects. But this power remains occult or spell-like, precisely insofar as the rulishness of subjective law apes the forcefulness of objective power. The law the subject prescribes to things mimes the force that things exert upon each other. And in this regard, law's mimesis of force is rooted in the subject's affinity with the object, thought succumbs to the spell of determining force by imposing it upon things. Thus, the spell is, this is Adorno, the spell is the equivalent of the fetish character of the commodity, the self-made thing become a thing in itself, from which the self cannot escape anymore, end quote. How does the self escape the thing whose domination over it reflects the self's domination of the thing? Reflexive self-consciousness yields a subject capable only of recognizing itself in its objective reflection. It cannot break the spell because it is another of its symptoms. If mimesis without consciousness reinstates fatality, the compulsiveness of blind adaptation, and consciousness without mimesis maintains the compulsiveness of identity, or self-subjugation through subjugation of the other, then what we could ask, what separates the mimesis performed by consciousness, but that is not apperceptive, from the mimesis in consciousness, which is, how does the mimesis performed by consciousness evade the mimetic dimension of consciousness, its subjection to socially inculcated necessity? Then the answer is through impulse as determinate negation of duty and inclination, or personality and compulsion. It is impulse that undoes the spell of reflection. Impulse animates consciousness without being objectively apprehended. And through it, consciousness mimes the compulsion it has instilled in the object, rehearsing the affinity between what is unlike it within it, the multiplicity of drives, and what is unlike it outside it, the unity of force. Likeness of the unlike, mimesis releases the self from itself, and thereby from what it was compelled to take for a thing in itself. So it is not critical reflection that breaks the spell of semblance, but impulse as what prevents reflection from reproducing the causal closure of totality. And in this regard, Adorno is a thinker of spontaneity rather than reflection, and of rupture rather than resignation. We began by asking how the historicization and deontologization of dialectics could revolve around the moral opposition between rightness and wrongness. And the answer is that it is precisely this distinction that marks the incompleteness of actuality, its splitting into total semblance and incomplete truth, into the semblance of totality and the truth of fragmentation. At the heart of this scission lies a historically specific phenomenon, the capitalist law of exchange. And what leads Adorno to characterize this split as one between wrongness and rightness is the fact that it transects the phenomenal and noumenal aspects of human freedom. And here Adorno remains closer to Hegel than to Kant. Rather than oppose the idea of non-contradictory freedom to the reality of its contradictoriness, or noumenal freedom to phenomenal unfreedom, he seeks to show how the contradictoriness of the concept of freedom is overcome in actuality, but not the semblance of actuality integrated in and through the law, in and through the law of exchange, but through the true actuality which it covers over, even as it depends upon it. The actuality of the non-equivalent and the unexchangeable, continually secreted through the human activities parasitized by the law of exchange. Yeah, I'm almost done, just one. Okay, this is the end. Nevertheless, something is missing from this account. Recall how in Adorno's analysis, the semblance of equivalence between abstract value and concrete labor depends upon the semblance of equality, i.e. the merely formal freedom between capitalists and proletarians. False equivalence is conditioned by real inequivalence, or more precisely, by the division of producers from the means of production. The scission of class haunts the synthesis of exchange. Impulse, or the additional factor, ruptures the synchronization of subject and object, programmed by equivalence, and unites them through an affinity beyond equivalence. But while affinity releases the subject from the person, coordinating the multiplicity of drives in an act without equivalence, it does not release the subject from the grip of the class relation, which is the real scission enforcing the law of exchange. And here I think the concept of scission is very close to what Alexei was talking about this morning. Class is not an identity, but a predicament, the trauma of originary collective dispossession. In Adorno's account, the resistance of impulse remains confined within the bounds of the individual. The acts of resistance he cites are individual and not collective. He gives two examples. He cites a German army officer who took part in the plot to kill Hitler. That's the one example he gives in History and Freedom. The other example, interesting enough, is Hamlet. Those are the two examples he gives. It's important that he believes that the additional factor is real and not just an ideality, but it seems necessarily individual, confined to the level of an individual agent. And the question is whether impulse could relay an affinity among subjects who have been stripped of the accoutrements of bourgeois subjectivity by the class relation, a subjective affinity beyond intersubjectivity or recognition, uniting subjects not only beyond the utilitarian imperatives of self-preservation, but beyond the socially mandated imperative of collective reproduction governed by the law of exchange. Beyond the affinity of impulse lies the affinity of class as collective dispossession, which ramifies beyond the unity of individuals and nation states into a commonality without equivalence.